Hello everybody. In this presentation we're going to talk about the basics of Playmaker, and we're going to walk through this concept of setting up a scenario that gets user input from your game scenario or gets input from the game engine itself. Now we'll take a look and kind of look through the lens of Playmaker, but the basic concept here that we want to take away is that there are two kinds of input that we can capture when we make more complex scenarios in Unity. And that kind of input is either getting input from the user, and that would typically take the form of keyboard input, mouse, game controller, tapping on a screen, that sort of thing. Or we would get input from the game engine. So it would be the game engine interacting with elements inside our scene to provide some kind of feedback or some kind of event. So we're going to take a look at the basics of a state machine using Playmaker. There's a little graphic here kind of illustrating what we're going to look at and kind of more or less what our logic is going to look like when we start developing content inside Playmaker. And the basic concept is that we're going to build these state machines that are based on events, transitions, and states. The states here are indicated in gray. Everything else is considered a transition event, and anything that has a line that connects two states, we can consider that a transition. So the basic concept is that when we have some logic that starts running, it's attached to a game object. It transitions from its start event, so the game object comes live, and it does whatever it's told to do until a condition is met. Now, the condition that is met is often based on either user input or game engine input, in very simple terms, and of course that can get pretty complex pretty quick. And then based on a condition being met, we transition to another state. In this case, this is a simple walk and idle or walk and stop state, where in one state our character might be walking, and if a condition is met, if we tap a button or if we run into a wall, it'll transition down to where it's no longer walking. So that's the basic kind of high-level concept of a state machine. We'll take a look at this in practical terms inside Unity. And so to set up this scenario, I already have Playmaker installed and configured. You can see that from the previous video presentation. And I'm just going to set up a really quick scenario similar to the Gravity Lab, where we have two elements that are inside our environment that we can take a look at the difference between user input and game engine input, utilizing Playmaker in Unity. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a 3D object. It's a cube, and I'm going to call this ground. So I'm going to set up just a simple ground plane. I'm going to scale this out a bit so that we can drop some spheres on this thing and have them bounce around. Again, kind of a similar setup to what we did in the Gravity Lab, but I'm going to reinforce some of the concepts and introduce the idea of a state machine here. So the first thing I want to point out is that the default orientation in our game space is that we're looking in a perspective view, kind of looking away from the z-axis. The z-axis, the blue axis, is pointing in a direction, and that's an important thing to keep in mind here. We have this widget also indicating what the z direction is. We can think of the positive z direction or the forward z direction as our north orientation in terms of our cardinal directions. And this isn't an arbitrary choice. When we start making characters and game objects that we want to move quote unquote forward, by default it's going to use its z-axis unless we tell it otherwise. And so whenever we come across this language or orientation of forward-facing assets, we're talking about the positive z. So I always like to kind of orbit my preview to kind of look in a specific direction, so I know that generally I'm looking north, just so I have some basic orientation. The other thing too is if I look through the main camera, so I have my preview down here and I see my camera is selected, it's no accident that a default camera is looking in the positive z direction as well. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to orbit it down just a little bit, lift it up just a bit, so I'm looking at the ground over here. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new sphere. And this sphere, I'm going to lift it up just a bit, and I'm going to call this is my user sphere. So this sphere, I'm going to add just a simple rigid body to it, just like we did in the Gravity Lab. but we'll start taking some specific control over it. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body, and make sure that this object is falling properly. So I'm going to hit the play button. Going to watch this object fall to the ground. Does just what it's supposed to do. And now, once I have this rigid body attached, let me just collapse some of these windows so you can see this. We have this rigid body component, and we've played around with some of these elements, these parameters before. But what I'm going to do is I'm either going to turn off gravity, or I'm going to play around with this kinematic setting. Now, if I just turn off gravity, if I uncheck that, when I hit the play button, you can see that the sphere does not fall through the air. I'm going to create a scenario where when I hit the space bar, it turns gravity on for this object and it falls to the ground. And to do that, we'll use Playmaker. So I have Playmaker configured, and just a reminder, once Playmaker is installed, we want to go to Playmaker Editor window. Let me turn this little pop-up off here. And I've nested my Playmaker editor down to the bottom right of my project panel, and just kind of refocus that so I have the majority of this bottom space looking at the Playmaker editor. And I have this actions browser. Now, for the time being, so that we can clearly delineate these, I'm going to move my actions browser off to the right so that we can see a clear break between the inspector and the Playmaker editor, so we can get a kind of clear sense of the workflow here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the user sphere. I'm going to right click inside the Playmaker editor window, anywhere in this green space. I'm going to right click and choose to add an FSM. FSM stands for finite state machine. We're going to just refer to these as state machines. And I'm going to right click add FSM. And so what I'm left with now is I have a one state machine. We have a start transition event. So in other words, when this game object starts, or when it comes alive, so when I hit the play button and look at this in my game view, it's going to pass in from the start transition over into state one. Playmaker, the Playmaker editor on the left side in this gray space, this is where we're going to build our Playmaker graph. And there's going to be, we're going to start off pretty simple, and it'll start to get more and more complex. But Playmaker is a useful tool in that we don't have to stare at lines and lines of code in order to get our basic logic for our gameplay or our interactivity established. We can focus more on the core logic rather than the syntax. And I'll demonstrate what I mean a little bit later. But for now, I just want to kind of break down the essentials of a state machine in Playmaker. So we have the flow of our start state into state one. And on the right side here, by default, we're looking at the state tab. And you'll notice that I can rename the state tab. I might call this init or initialization, or I want to give this kind of an appropriate name. Maybe I'll call this idle. So it's waiting for something to happen. It's a good idea to name our states with some basic logic or the basic function that they're providing. In this case, we're idling or we're waiting. Okay. Now, there's a couple of other tabs here. We'll talk about events and variables as needed. We'll quickly get to the events here in just a moment. But for now, we'll stay focused on the state. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the play button, Command P or Control P. And I just want to point out, take a look and see what we're looking at. So currently this sphere is not falling because even though it has a rigid body, it's not using gravity. If I look at my state machine here, you can see that it's green, which means that it's running. We went from the start state into the idle state. The idle state doesn't have any actions or any logic associated with it, so it's just sitting here and it's stuck here until, we tell it to do something else. Now, what I want to do is I want to build a state machine that's going to allow for us to turn on the gravity dynamically. So if I flip on the gravity, you can see that that sphere falls to the ground. By the way, when I toggle the play button, gravity flips back off, and that's because by default, when we modify a parameter when the game is running, those parameters snap back to their original. So I know that I can toggle gravity in order to get the effect that I want, but I want to translate that into some simple input from the user so that the user can determine when that sphere falls. And we'll do this with some simple keyboard input. So if I look over here, so first off, I have the idle state selected in my state machine. If I click over here in the right space, you can see it's deselected. There's a couple of things that are indicating that the state is deselected. First of all, there's no information in the state window, and the state is no longer highlighted as blue. So if I click on it again, you can see that we have a little bit of information here. This is the active state that we've selected. With the state selected, I can go start to look at some actions. Now, I have this action browser, and this is a really comprehensive list of a lot of stuff that we can do, and we can build, entire games and all of our logic with this library of things. Just to give you a few things to look at, we have a transform component up here, which we know governs the position, scale, and rotation. We have a corresponding transform category here that if I click on the transform category and scroll through here, you can see that we have all these different actions associated with position, scale, and rotation. We'll take a look at some of those later. But as I click through, I just want to point out that there's a preview down here of what the action, some of the parameters that it gives you, and a description of how it works. What I'm most interested is influencing the rigid body, which we happen to get from components physics. So I'm looking for a physics component. So if I look up here, there's physics 2D. We want to skip that. I want to go right into the physics category. And I'm looking for something that references gravity. So I'm searching through here, and I'm looking for gravity, and I see use gravity. Now, if I don't want to look through this, or I'm curious about how I might find an action associated with gravity and I don't know where to find it, I could go up to the search field and just type in gravity. And when I do, it'll reveal all of the action sets that are associated with gravity. I'm going to clear that out because otherwise I can't see all of the actions. And again, this is a pretty comprehensive list. We're not going to be overwhelmed by this list because we're going to focus on just a couple of core elements to get used to this. And we're going to spend a lot of time both in our physics category here, transform category, and a few other things. But just for this demo, we're going to go into physics. We're going to go find the use gravity. There it is. And I can get this action on this state one of two ways. The easiest thing to do is with the state selected, I'm just going to double click, and you can see that that action has been added to this state. Alternatively, what I can do is I can click and drag and drag the action in. But I find it a little bit cleaner just to double click. Now, in this case, I have two actions. I don't need a duplicate of this action, and so I have a couple of different options. I can click on this little cog over here and choose to remove action, or I can simply select the title and hit the delete key and it'll go away. So let's take a look at what's going on here. We have a user sphere. Attached to that user sphere is a state machine that has one state called idle, and that state has an action that says use gravity, and the use gravity field is checked. We'll talk a little bit about what this means here in just a second. But before we do, I want to point out that this is kind of an object-oriented relationship between this state machine and this object. In other words, if I select another game object, you'll see that this state machine goes away. And it only becomes available when we go back to the object that's been assigned to it. So the user sphere owns, or is the owner of, this state machine. This object has the state assigned to it. We can tell a couple of different ways. One, there is a little Hutong Games developer icon that pops up in the inspector. It's a little red icon here. And I can see that that is an indicator that this has a state machine on it. Also, if I click around on some of these objects that don't have state machines, you can see that there's nothing here. There's several different ways that we can navigate state machines. If I click on this drop-down menu, this allows me to choose a specific state. We only have one game object here, and it's saying that these are all the game objects with state machines in the scene, and currently it's just the user sphere. So if I select that, it takes me back and selects that object. So, if we get disoriented, these are the things that we can look for. Now let's take a look at what this state is providing. So the logic here is that when this object comes live, or when it starts, it goes to the idle state. The idle state contains an action that says use gravity. And the use gravity checkbox is checked. Now, whenever we see a checkbox, this is a Bool data type, and we come into contact with this very often. In other words, we have a mesh render component here. It has a Bool, and what the mesh render does is it tells the this sphere, any game object that is rendering in space is going to have a mesh renderer. If I uncheck that, this object visually disappears. So the unchecked state is false, the checked state is true. When we influenced gravity, we said use gravity? No, we unchecked that. So we set it to false. So use gravity equals false. Over here, this state is saying use gravity. The game object that we're targeting is the owner. So that's the user sphere. Now we can target other game objects, and we'll talk about scenarios why we'd want to do that. But maybe I want to target another object or multiple objects that activate their gravity all at the same time. But in this case, it's simply saying use the owner, and it's the owner that this script is attached to. In this case, it's user sphere, and set the gravity parameter to true or to checked. So just in review, we went to the physics category, and we're accessing the rigid body component through physics, and we're looking at the use gravity. Currently, this is set to on, which is not exactly what we want to do because we get the same results if I hit the play button and test this state machine. Effectively, what it does is it turns back on use gravity. We don't want that to happen. We want to wait for some user input before we flip this on. And so the trick is going to be to have a second state. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to right-click and add a state. So I'm right-clicking over here in the gray workspace of the Playmaker editor window, and I'm choosing to add a second state. This state is now selected, and I'm going to call this, maybe I'll call it drop object, or I could call it activate gravity, but I might want to do more things than just activate gravity. So I gave it a more general description and just said, drop object, because maybe I want other things to happen. Maybe I want some music to play, some sound effects. Maybe I want a particle effect in the background, some lighting change. A lot of stuff could happen when I drop this. So this is the second state. Now, if I go back over to the original idle state, I'm going to keep this use gravity state. It's going to feel a little redundant, but I'm just going to turn off use gravity. So that solves our initial problem of when the game object starts, it starts to use gravity. And I realized that, use gravity is turned off, and so we don't even need an action here. But bear with me for just a second so we can take a closer look at that. I'm now going to switch over to my drop object state. Here we want to use gravity again. So I'm making sure my drop object state is selected. I'm going to go to the physics category. I'm going to find use gravity and double click. You'll also notice that I'm using 2 instances of use gravity, and it's keeping track here and showing me that this state machine is currently using 2 different instances of that action. Now in the drop object state, again, we're talking to the owner of this object and we're saying use gravity, and we're going to leave that turned on. So if I hit the play button, currently there's no way to get from the idle state to the dropped state. So we're currently stuck here in the idle state. And this is the kind of core functionality of a state machine. We're in one state until we're told to move to a different state under some kind of condition. And so this makes it really easy in terms of thinking in state machines about constructing either a simple logic or a complex logic. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to sit in the idle state until we get some user input like a mouse click or a keyboard press or something like that. So I'm going to add that bit of logic to this. I'm going to go to the idle state and make sure it's selected. And I'm going to go to my actions browser, and I'm looking specifically for a category called input. Now from input, there's lots of different kinds of input that we can capture. And what I'm looking for is a basic get key down. There's get button down. We'll talk about those later in this project, but get key down is where we want to focus right now. So I'm going to double click. I see that get key down has been added. So effectively we're listening for some input, and the key that we want to listen to is listed here. These are all the alphanumeric keys in the keyboard. And if I look, probably about 8 or 9 items down is the space key, the space bar. So I'm going to choose space. So effectively, we're listening for the space bar. And if we get the space bar from the user, we want to send an event. Now, the way that we transition from one state to another is through a combination of events and transitions. They usually work together. In some cases, there might be a slight break. But for now, what we want to do is we want to create a send event. There's 2 ways to create a send event. The easiest thing to do is going to be to click on this drop-down menu, see if there are any existing events, custom events that you can use. In other words, any other events that you might have made for this state machine. But because we haven't made any events, we're not going to have any listed. We don't want to use system events. We don't want to use UI events. We want to create a new custom event for our own purposes here. So the new event that we're listening to, we can kind of think of this like a street sign or a wayfinding sign that just directs us to a new location. I'm going to be very literal about this, and I'm just going to say key has been pressed. Now, I'll hit return. You'll see we're getting a little error here. And the idea is normally my transition events won't be this long. I'll keep them a little bit more simple, but I want to be very literal here just so we can kind of see how this works. Now we're getting an error. And it says the event is not used by the state or global transition. So it's saying that the event is not being used by the state. And in order to fix that, we have to have an event listed underneath this state to give it a logical transition out. So if we go back here to this original diagram, we have a walking state. So this is equivalent to the idle state that we've just made. We've just created an event. In the case of this diagram, it says stop. We've created one that says, key has been pressed. So we want our transition event to show up as an option to exit this state and flow into another state. And so the way that we're going to do that, we could simply click on this red error and Playmaker will fix this error for us. So if I click on it, you can see that key has been pressed gets added. Now that's an easy way from a workflow standpoint. I'm going to undo that and back up just for a second. Because if we rely too heavily on the software and not know what's kind of happening behind the scenes, we could get ourselves painted into a corner. And so effectively what we're doing is once we create a transition event, if I right click on this state, we can add a transition. Now there's custom and system events and all this stuff listed, but in addition to these pre-configured system and UI events, we have the custom event that we created. A key has been pressed. And so if I select that, you can see that that's been added to the bottom of the state. When I deselect that, you can see it's light gray. So we have the state called idle. We have the key has been pressed is called the event. Now I'm still getting an error here. And the reason I'm getting the error is because this logic is incomplete. So currently the logic is when we hit the play button, our object becomes active in our game scene. So we start the game object and we end up in the idle state. Use gravity is turned off. We agree that that's a redundant step. And that's just to kind of make sure that, if we want to leave this checked on, so use gravity, we're flipping it off in the idle state. We're turning that function off. That's why I'm keeping this to demonstrate that, and we'll take a deeper dive into that in a moment. The next bit of logic is that we're waiting for a key to be pressed. And if we get the result of the spacebar being pressed, then we should transition following this key has been pressed. But that doesn't go anywhere. There should be a line to control the flow. So if we had multiple states, we could, I'm just left clicking and dragging from this event title. You can see we get an arrow. Again, I'm left clicking, and I can snap that to an existing state. So when I snap this and release it, you can see that my error goes away. So the logic is changed just a little bit. The idle state turns off gravity is the first thing that happens. By the way, these are sequential in order. They run from the top down. So the first thing that's going to happen here is that the gravity gets turned off for the owner object. The next thing is that we're waiting for the user to provide some input. In this case, it's spacebar. And if we get that input, we're going to follow the key has been pressed event. Well, the key has been pressed event we've wired over to the dropped object. In the dropped object, we have used gravity and we've turned that back on. So let's test this. We'll hit the play button, and now what we're doing is we're debugging. This is what's called debugging our logic, or we're watching the flow of our logic. And right now we can see that our sphere is still floating in the sky. We're stuck in the idle state because what we're listening for is some user input. Now, you can see that this action is highlighted, and so it's kind of like waiting for this to be satisfied before it follows this transition. And I'm just going to tap the spacebar, and when I do, you can see that it transitions to the drop object. Now, I'm going to toggle the play button because there is one thing that we should pay attention to when we start providing input to our game. When I hit the play button, if I do not have focus, so if my mouse is not actively in the gameplay window, and I'm clicking around here to make sure that that window has focus, if I'm inadvertently over here, and I'm clicking on, even though I see the state machine and the last thing I clicked on was the hierarchy, when I go over to the game view, I'm tapping the spacebar and nothing's happening. And that's because Unity thinks I'm trying to do something with the spacebar over here in this window. And so this is like a really easy rookie mistake to make. We made some good, clean logic that's listening for the spacebar. I'm trying to test it and it doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click inside the game view just to make sure that this window has focus. And now I'm going to press the spacebar, and you can see that everything works. I'll toggle the play button. That resets everything. This is an example of user input. In the next video, we'll take a look at game engine input. So things that happen based on the game engine interpreting some interaction. And so those are going to be the two kind of key differences between any kind of input that we'll utilize for our gameplay. But we'll do that in the next presentation.